Well, it looks like we're at noon, so let's go ahead and get started here. I want to start off by saying welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. This is our third Zoom session for our Minnesota Grazing School series. I'm Leah Matsky with the Minnesota Grazing Lands Conservation Association, and today we're going to be talking about livestock nutrition, types of grazing, and forage quality. Speaking with us, we have Sabrina Florentino and Troy Salzer from the University of Minnesota. Before we start, I want to quick say, please keep your mic muted during the presentation. Drop your questions in the chat and we'll be sure to address them. And there will be a replay of this session emailed to you and posted on our website after this session. So with that, go ahead and take over, Sabrina and Troy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Leah. As Leah mentioned, I'm Sabrina Florentino. I'm an alternative livestock systems extension educator with the University of Minnesota. And in that role, I work a lot with pasture-based systems, and I'm based here in southern Minnesota where we graze and raise beef, dairy cattle, and sheep. And I will let Troy introduce himself. I know you all have met him if you have been faithfully attending our webinars, but maybe we have some new people as well.
Well, good day to all of you. Today's topic is really an exciting one for me. I think it really will help to flesh out some of the knowledge base of what you are needing in relationship to the nutrition side of it. So I hope that we'll be able to do a great job conveying some of the basic information and also help you improve your background. As Sabrina and Leah suggested, my name is Troy Salzer. I work as a local extension educator in St. Louis County up in northeastern Minnesota. And in my area, pastures are really a vital part of agriculture production, and it's part of the reason why I spend so much time with pasture as well as forage species management.
So as Troy mentioned, we are going to go over a number of animal science principles, so get to the basics of what we're looking at, and it's really an overview of livestock nutrition. Neither of us are nutritionists by training, but would encourage you if you have the opportunity to work with a nutritionist as well. But in any case, to just use this background information as you're making decisions on your own operations and really trying to meet those nutrient requirements for your livestock. So I know that Troy and Tara sort of talked about this concept, taking a holistic view of grazing, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention, why I'm interested in grazing, similar to Troy. And these are the first three things that came to my mind. They're pretty similar to what Troy and Tara mentioned as well. But on our farm, we're really, really interested in soil health. I was just at a field day that's happening at my farm right now, looking at the rainfall simulator and just how important our perennials on the landscape are for soil health, and then even more so utilizing our livestock to stimulate that biology and soil microbial activity. Along with that, I think about livestock welfare. So just having our ruminants out grazing and being able to express their natural behaviors to the greatest point possible can lead to really, really, a healthy flock, a healthy herd, and tied in with that lower inputs would compared to some other, feeding systems that we have as an option as well. So I'll step off the soapbox there about why grazing is so important. You're all here because this is a grazing school, so likely you already know these things. But getting back into our discussion on nutrition, we're just going to talk quickly about the physiology of our livestock and then tie that into the nutrient requirements that they have and how those fluctuate as they are growing and throughout their production cycle. We'll talk about forage quality and how important that is to meeting those requirements, what supplementation might look like in our grazing systems, and then, once we have a grazing plan, how do we evaluate that plan or a nutrition plan, how do we evaluate its efficacy on our operation?
In this particular case, Sabrina and I think it's really important to help you better understand the aspects of why a ruminant is so important with the four compartments that we have in the rumen system, and how, in essence, that plays a very vital role in relationship to converting forages into an energy for the sheep, goats, and beef cattle. Now, we also can think about the aspects of hogs, monogastric, horses, which are also a modified monogastric, and also the aspects of poultry, another form of a monogastric. Now, in each of these cases, they really don't have the same ability of the rumen to actually convert forages into an energy source quite as well as a ruminant does. And so it's really critical to truly understand that if we think about utilizing things like pigs or poultry, the aspects of their digestive system, being able to extract those nutrients are not nearly as efficient. Part of that is just simply the overall capacity for them to consume enough. And so, with a horse and also with a hog, as they digest the forages, most of that digestion actually is in the cecum or their large intestine, and it just doesn't give you nearly as much opportunity to extract the nutrients. And so we will focus our attention primarily on the aspects of ruminant digestion today.
So then just a quick note within our ruminants that we do have differences between species, whether it's a goat, a sheep, or a cow. Again, you can see our pigs and our poultry are sort of left outside of this triangle, but um, this we're looking at the grazing preferences here of our or foraging preferences of these particular species, and you can see the two different graphs show the same information. One may be easier to understand than the other, but our cattle are going to generally prefer a greater amount or proportion of grass in their diets. They'll have a good amount of forbs in there, but they're less likely to browse. Whereas our sheep are more of our intermediate foragers. They will graze still a good amount of grass. They're going to pay more attention to our leafy broadleaf plants, our legumes, our dandelions, our weeds. They'll take off more of those forages, and then our goats, of course, will um, even more. The sheep will also browse, but the goats even more so will pay attention to those woody species. And tying into what Troy was mentioning about the capacity of their digestive systems, that comes into play in these scenarios as well. Our cows have a much larger capacity to intake large amounts of forage, and within that, they have a greater amount of time to access the nutrients in maybe stemmier grass or lower quality material that way, and they are less selective. So their muzzle does not allow them to, select little pieces of leaves, whereas our small ruminants are more apt to do that. So if you've had any of these combination of these species on your farm, you've likely already noticed the differences in the way that they may graze or forage, and that plays into really the the diet that they are actually consuming, even though they may be all offered the same, pasture, they are possibly picking different species in different proportions in order to meet their nutrient requirements.
So, as we begin to really break down the aspects of what sort of components we need to provide animals, it pretty much is simply boiled down to water, energy, protein, and vitamins and minerals. And these we hope to be able to supply not only from the aspects of the vegetation that we're providing, but also think about the aspects of being able to supplement throughout the entire process as you're offering them their daily ration.
So we'll walk through these nutrients that we listed out here and try to tie them in roughly with our forages that we have that we are likely going to be grazing. And we start with water because it is probably the most important nutrient and often the most overlooked. And when we think about water as a nutrient requirement, we want to think about quantity, but also quality. So this is just a plug to think to consider. You can even have your water tested. We'll talk about, of course, testing our forages later on, but you can test your water as well and ensuring that the quality is there for our livestock really will drive their feed intake as well. So water is essential, both again in quantity and quality. And the amount of water that our livestock are going to consume is going to vary as they're grazing throughout the season. And part of this is due to the vegetation. So as our forages mature in their maturity stages, they are going to have less moisture content, and therefore our livestock are getting less of their water requirements from the forage and will have to consume more water. This often is going to coincide, of course, with increased temperatures and environmental factors. But this is just to point out that in any case, we should still provide the average amount of water that our livestock species needs. But in a scenario when you have to be refilling a water, if it's not automatic, just to be aware that as our forages get more mature, we may need to be refilling waters more frequently. And if you do have multiple species, those water requirements, of course, are going to vary greatly. When from the dairy cow that's consuming 20 to 50 gallons of water per day to sheep that may only need a couple gallons a day.
Before you move on, Sabrina, one thing that I would say also in relationship to this is we mentioned the aspects of the size of the rumen of these particular species, and even within that, their overall capacity. And as we further discuss the aspects of the nutrient density of some of these forages, there is situations where the animals that you are grazing just simply do not have enough capacity. And so, therefore, we may end up having to add some dry matter. For example, if we're grazing a very, very high water containing cover crop mix, for example. And so, keep that in mind as you are also thinking about what pasture or paddock you might be using for a particular species. And and realize that one, they may not be drinking any water or very little because they don't need it. And two, adding that extra dry matter may increase their productivity dramatically if they just simply cannot consume enough dry matter.
Right. So they might be meeting their water requirements, but not the rest of their nutrient requirements. Really great point there, Troy.
In this next chart that we have here, I think this is extremely valuable. On each of the sides of that graph, we can see digestibility as a percentage, and as we look at the digestibility of forages, them new shoots that we have just coming up or regrowing are extremely digestible. And generally, we also think about them from an energy standpoint as also being extremely digestible. And as those plants mature, become reproductive, producing heads specifically, not only does the digestibility of that go down, but also the energy content of those forages that your livestock are consuming are going down. And with that in mind, this is a double-edged sword, both in a bad way. And so, as you are managing your livestock, it's important to keep these things in mind so that we are achieving not only the adequate digestibility, but also adequate energy, and those two things meeting the requirements of those animals. This is something, a somewhat of a skill, and this is not a purely math equation. This is something that you will have to continue to monitor. And as you become a more efficient grazer, you will keep this in mind and actually become more proficient at it.
And I suppose just to back up, I forgot to mention this earlier, but when we talk about energy, as in energy is not a nutrient, but we talk about our energy requirements and where is energy coming from? It's coming from our carbohydrates and in small amounts our fats. So on the back of any food you pick up, the nutrition facts won't say what percent energy. But for our livestock, we bring those two things together and we look at what percent energy or what amount of energy is in our forage. And then our digestibility is how much of that is available, can the livestock access easily, just because we'll continue to talk about those concepts as we move forward. So similar trends that we're seeing with our energy and our digestibility with our crude protein. So we're looking at protein now as our both on this graph, our grass and our alfalfa mature, our crude protein is going to be much higher in our vegetative stages, and then continue to decrease as our forages mature, whether it's grass or alfalfa. Of course, our legumes like alfalfa are going to have higher protein levels in general, but most forages in that early vegetative stage are going to be really, really high in quality and protein in this case.
As we think about the aspects of vitamins and minerals, this is something that is mostly not taken into great consideration. And I think that we want to make sure that you're well aware that vitamins and minerals are critical for the reproduction of animals, for milk production, for muscle growth, the aspects of energy. And so these things should not be overlooked in relationship to the overall health of the animal. This is very complicated, as you can see in this chart on the right-hand side. The amount of interactions that you have between things like zinc and copper and manganese, all of these components have interactions. And so, for example, in my area, northeastern Minnesota, the Iron Range, we have tremendously high levels of iron, for example. And how does that impact the aspects of the digestibility of copper and zinc and manganese? Now, this is really a component of why you want to keep this in mind. Visit with your neighbors as grazers to see if they've had issues with specific nutrient deficiencies. And it's very localized. And so we want you to be aware that this is the case. And oftentimes providing a good vitamin salt trace mineral package will alleviate this. But ultimately, it is a consideration as you go through this season. In this next graph, I apologize. Go ahead, Sabrina.
So just as Troy was mentioning, it is very localized, and these are just some of the factors that are impacting your forage mineral content. And a good reason why it's nice to have a test on whatever you're feeding your animals and but then to keep in mind that that can change. So our location, our soil type, even our fertilization rates on that land, rainfall, and our plant maturity, just as things change with our crude protein and our energy, those same quality fluctuations happen with our minerals and vitamins. Did you want to talk about this map, Troy?
I can. This here is an example of selenium and its availability in certain regions of Minnesota. You can see in northeastern Minnesota or the eastern half of Minnesota, we oftentimes are short in selenium. And this is something that I personally have experienced, white muscle disease in newborn calves and lambs and goats. And it is very localized, and it is a relationship that we have with other nutrients, perhaps higher phosphorus contents in the soil, making the selenium less available, so on and so forth. And then we can go the other end of the spectrum where you can see these dark
Done and
areas
done, huh?
that actually have excessive amounts of selenium. And selenium is one of those nutrients that can become toxic if the animals consume some too much. And so, with that in mind, I think it's really important. Uh, the previous slide that Sabrina had shown you here, rainfall was a component of how this season actually impacts, such as with grass tetany, for example, and the magnesium availability. And so, as you go through and are becoming a better grazer, you'll think about these things and become more aware of them. And so we're just trying to help you point that out.
And Troy, in some of those examples you mentioned, likely you're providing a mineral mix, species-specific mineral mix, but we can still have issues beyond that, you want to work with your veterinarian or your nutritionist, or as Troy mentioned, talk to your neighbors, especially if you're new to the area, what have people experienced before?
Thank you. Additionally, the as some work was demonstrated back in 1972, and this is not something that should be a surprise to the average person, but as we look at the carotene, vitamin A, D, all of these vitamin concentrations, as it's growing, it is fixing or creating that vitamin. Uh, Concentration, and throughout the season we actually see variability. Now in this particular case, this was on native range land, and it just demonstrates how it's so critical before April, and once you get into August and September, how critical it is to be providing vitamins to your livestock, because that bar that we see there in that graph, it actually demonstrates where the nutrient requirements are for beef cattle specifically. And so there's a period of time that we actually are above that in concentration, but then it also gets to a point where it's below that. Now, if you're doing a good job managing it, managing your forage and keeping it young and fresh, this might be spread out for a longer period of time. But once again, keeping this in mind so that we're properly supplementing the animals.
So we've gone over our major nutrients that we want to keep in mind, that we're meeting all of those requirements, but those requirements themselves will fluctuate, as we've already mentioned, as our livestock age and throughout their production cycles. So this next section here, we'll just go through a few examples of that relatively quickly, but keep and the relationships usually hold true across all species, but take some time to get to know the numbers for your livestock that you are raising specifically. This first example here is for dairy calves and heifers, and you can see as they age from a month old all the way to close to calving, we're looking at their protein requirements on the top yellow line compared to their dry matter intake requirements. So the the quantity of feed that they need to consume. And then, of course, compared to their weight, that will be increasing as they grow. But in general, our younger animals are going to need higher protein requirements, the highest of anybody. Of course, they'll be nursing on mom in the beef cattle case. We're going to be feeding our dairy calves, and they're getting a lot of that protein from milk. Um, if they are grazing, hopefully we're on really high quality forage at that point as well. Um, and as their mothers are lactating, we're aiming for that. And then as they get older, into their a year and older, they're pretty similar, getting closer to the mature cows' requirements, at least the lactating mature cows' requirements for protein, and then it'll sort of plateau after that. But obviously, as they're growing, their dry matter intake needs are increasing as well.
Same thing is true of the reproducing sheep and goat as we go throughout the season and through their annual production cycle. You can see that with gestation, early gestation, we actually have a period where the animal is has relatively low requirements for digestive energy. As we get closer and closer to parturition, we start to step up the energy needs. And this looks like a nice little stair step. We all know that that's not necessarily the case. It's a gradual line over time, and you can see that dotted line. But some of the things that you need to consider in relationship to this is as those components change, you'll need to make sure that you're actually achieving those nutrient needs so that you don't run into other metabolic disorders. Um, Pregnancy disease, for example, other things like that. And then as we get to parturition and early lactation, that energy demand does go up. And so therefore we want to make sure that we're actually supplying enough energy so those animals don't lose weight during that period of time. And then once you wean those ewes or lambs from those ewes, then that energy demand drops dramatically until you begin to flush them again later in the season. This is a fairly complex graph, but it is something that you need to take into consideration as you're going through this process.
And maybe it's just, when looking at all these figures, when are the critical time points that you need to make sure that nutrition is on point? When, we have really young animals, when we have gestating animals getting late into their pregnancy, and then when they're lactating, we need to make sure that we are meeting those nutrient requirements for both the adults and the young stock. And then it will fluctuate even whether, especially for small ruminants, they're supporting a single or twins or triplets or quadruplets. Their nutrient requirements, of course, will increase with that added demand on their energy and protein levels as they're producing more milk for those additional youngins.
As we look at this next graph, again, you can see the point at which we're calving. We have the both the energy, dry matter intake, as well as the protein requirements during the different stages in relationship to this. And really, the key to this is that are we
Oh,
able
Troy,
to
I would pause you there. This is my editing mistake. The calving and weaning should be shifted over. I shifted the graph, but not the the markers. So calving is more like February instead.
Yes. So with that in mind, you can adjust your production schedule accordingly to make sure that we do match up better and we are able to supply those nutrients. And so that is really one of the components that we need to take into consideration so that we can have the actual pasture productivity achieve the goals of supplying both the energy and the protein is indicated by this particular graph if we shift that calving time.
Yep. So exactly as Troy mentioned. So the graph is showing our crude protein and dry matter requirements of our beef cattle. If we shift when they calve to May, which we might have other reasons for doing that, like, I don't know, Minnesota winters, um, that also, of course, will then align our, highest or peak demand for really high quality forage with when our forages in Minnesota are really taking off during that May to June time period.
So as we get into this further, you can see that the aspects of how complicated this process could be for the average beginning grazer. It might encourage you to think about working with a nutritionist, and these nutritionists often are supported by local feed mills. Maybe your local cooperative has a nutritionist on staff. Take the time to connect with these folks, see if they understand what your goals are, and then also think about are they familiar within your community? Are they able to work with sheep and goats? Has that been part of their experience? And so, as you go through this process, that's a part of the evaluation. Now, you can have other national and even international companies that represent a much broader understanding, and some of these will align well. In other cases, they might not have a good understanding of the high concentrations of selenium in your area, for example. So really take the time to work with them and determine what their knowledge base is. We also have independent consultants, nutritionists that aren't necessarily there to sell a particular product from a particular cooperative or other company. And along those same lines, I think it's also valuable to connect with potentially extension. And both Sabrina and I would have some awareness of some of these things, depending on where you are in Minnesota and such.
So then what would it look like if you're working with a nutritionist and, I've already, maybe I haven't. You may or may not be able to work with a nutritionist, whether that's, the size of your operation, your time, your economics, what have you. But if you were, these are the steps that they are thinking about, or even you can be thinking about when we're trying to create a nutrition plan for our livestock. So we've already done the first step. We're looking at quantifying the nutrient requirements of our livestock. You don't have to memorize any of those numbers you've seen in this presentation today, but they are available. So if you are interested and you have a problem spot or you want to know, you're comparing your forage tests to what your requirements are for your livestock, you can find these numbers if you just look up the nutrient requirements of beef cattle and look for the NRC. So that's the standardized nutrient requirements that tons of scientists have gotten together to create for you. Um, then we're looking at our feedstuffs. As I mentioned, we're taking, forage samples of our feedstuffs, of our pastures. We're getting those results back, and a nutritionist would use a ration formulation software to, match those up to match what we have available for our feed resources with the requirements of our livestock. And it doesn't stop there. Then we have to monitor that plan. We have to ensure that it's doing what we're thinking it should be. we reevaluate and we make adjustments. And again, either the nutritionist might do this, you might not have access to software, but you can get, samples of your forage and find any spots where you're low in said nutrient and try to fill in the gaps from there.
As we look at the aspects of what you have in your pastures, Sabrina did a nice job laying out some of the components of what specific species are most interested in consuming, whether it's the grasses, legumes, or forbs. But additionally, it's important for you to understand a few of the sort of components of these different species in that grasses generally mature relatively early. They are a cool season in most cases in Minnesota. They tend to lignify, but as they lignify, they don't necessarily lose their digestibility compared to legumes, for example. And so, as compared to with legumes, they generally have quite a bit higher crude protein as well as the forbs, and maintain that protein better than the grasses do as you go through the season. Then you add another layer of complexity, and that's what is your fertilization schedule in regards to this. Now, this is not supposed to be necessarily a management a discussion about each of these specific species, but we want you to understand that all of these components, and then if you layer on the selectivity of a goat, for example, and how does that impact the overall nutrition that the animal is receiving because of their actual selectivity and grazing techniques.
So you've seen similar graphs already, looking at the forage quality back in our nutrient requirements section, and we've to it many times, but just to reiterate that as our forages are maturing, that quality is generally decreasing, but of course our yield is increasing. So Joy mentioned we're trying to, try and hit that sweet spot of in between, later vegetative stages into reproductive stages. Somewhere in there, we're trying to maximize our quantity and quality. And then just to hit that home just a little bit more, think about how those plants are changing and why that relationship is changing with our forage digestibility. So you see the dotted line, our forage digestibility again, and that it's decreasing. Troy mentioned that our grasses lignify, but are still more digestible than when our legumes lignify. But in any case, as our stem yield increases, our stem, that's where we're going to find a lot of that lignin, and those plants are getting taller. That is playing a part into our forage digestibility. Our leaf yield, peaks and then it just sort of plateaus. So at the same time, our plants are getting taller. This is all in play when we are thinking about the forage quality. Again, but what the what are the livestock actually consuming? And that we can control with our grazing management, which we'll talk a bit more later on.
So in this next slide, we want to basically talk about the aspects of what is critical in relationship to allowing you as the grazer to better understand the forage that you are offering. This particular video, if you take a picture of that QR code, you can actually go there and look at that at a later point. It not only talks about sampling hay, for example, but it also talks about taking scissor clips. And this is really what Sabrina was describing in relationship to what are the animals actually consuming. So if you are leaving a 8-inch stubble height, for example, or a 6-inch stubble height, and you go out there and actually do a scissor clip where you're taking it down to 2 inches, it doesn't represent the actual quality of the forage that the animals are actually consuming. And so utilizing this tool to determine what the quality is needs to be representative of what you're actually doing as a management technique. Now, it's a very inexpensive test, and it is a great way for you to begin to monitor. Are you actually providing the nutrients necessary for your animals to be healthy?
Whoop, we don't need to listen to it. So this video is a very similar pasture sampling. So the first one talks more about our stored feed. This one you can take a picture of that QR code or go to the link, but this one will talk specifically about pasture sampling and, more importantly, how do you take a representative sample that Troy was alluding to already? And then also consider when you're taking those samples, what time of the year is it? How often do you do it? Can you use it as a tool to compare, management changes from year to year? Those are great ways to use it as well. But in any case, whether it's from our fresh clippings of our pasture or our stored feed, we're going to get back an analysis that looks something like this, telling us the nutrient content of our forages. This one's from Rock River Laboratory. You could there's many labs out there. There's Dairyland. You just want to search for, forage nutrient test and you can find a lab that's near you or compare prices, what have you, but they'll all be pretty similar with their printouts, that the results that you get, in that they are a bit complex if you're not used to looking at them. There's a number of statistics here. You can see our crude proteins at the top there. They'll break it down in amino acid. If you're working with cattle, they'll get even more specific with the different types of protein. You don't need to know all of them, but just be aware that there are resources out there to help you interpret those tests. Even the labs themselves will provide you some sort of gauge where your numbers, your specific forage numbers, fall, but also take into account, this Rock River Laboratory is probably looking at crude protein. 15% crude protein is actually pretty good for the majority of our livestock. So that's why it's useful to remember to look up the nutrient requirements of your particular species. We also have resources on the University of Minnesota website there with that QR code that helps you to get an idea. It compares it even to the quality categories for hay. So also useful if, for example, you are making hay and looking to sell, or you're looking to buy hay, look, what does it mean to be supreme quality? What does it mean to be premium? And it'll lay out the exact numbers that we're looking for, from acid detergent fiber to our relative feed value. Those are all terms that when you're talking about forage quality will be very common to hear. We don't have enough time to get into each one of those, but just be aware that we have resources out there, or shoot us a question if you have one on how to interpret those results.
Many folks talk about some of the anti-nutritional factors related to grazing. And in many cases, I think that folks become a little bit frightened by some of these components, and it actually limits them in relationship to utilizing all of the tools available to them. Now, this doesn't mean that I necessarily don't think it's critical to understand these components. As I've worked with many people that have run into problems, but as you become a better and better and better grazer, it does enable you to actually be able to manage your way through these things. Just recently, I was turning a group of cows out on a particular pasture, and I had done everything right. And I was visiting with a grazing specialist as I was doing it, literally at the exact time. And I was very concerned about the aspects of bloat, as the field that I was working with was almost a pure stand of alfalfa alfalfa. And then to take it even a step further, it was red clover and alfalfa. But because I had already introduced them before to fresh grass, a mixture that did contain some legumes, as well as it being late afternoon with the forages dry and the animals entering this pasture um, with a full belly already, it reduces my risk dramatically. This is true of things like nitrate, prussic acid. These are specific items related to things like sorghum and sorghum sudan grass, or nitrates are related to both brassicas as well as drought-stressed forages. All of these are really critical components, but as we become better and better grazers, we actually can overcome many of these components and learning about them in advance, putting diverse mixes together so they're not all sorghum or sorghum sudan grasses when a frost comes can help minimize that risk. And so, with that in mind, folks like Sabrina and I and other folks have a good understanding of these particular things and will help you manage your way through them.
And so with all these moving pieces, the nutrient requirements, the forage quality that changes as our forages are maturing, the anti-nutritional factors we may need to be aware of. How do we keep all of them, straight? Planning. Planning is so important. Of course, we can make a grazing plan and throw it out the first day of the grazing season because, something changes. But at least knowing mentally, even better if written down, walk through the entire year. What are my forage resources that I'm using at what points in the year? When do I have concerns that I would possibly need to be supplementing? Um, when do I have concerns for anti-nutritional factors? In the fall when we start to get frost on some of our annual species. Use this forage chain as a tool for that planning. And once you have those, Troy and Jeff will talk about it more in our next session. But once you have those resources laid out, you can better see, how can I improve this chain? How can I, extend my grazing season and apply economics to each one of these boxes? Where is my, most costly feed stuff? Is there a way that I can reduce the amount of time I'm using that feed stuff? We can get really creative with some of those things that we talked about on the last slide with summer annuals, with cover crops. Um, in any case, plan out when you are possibly going to be grazing those. Know what the nutrient value of those possible forages are. Know what class of livestock you may be grazing on them, and then consider are their nutrient requirements going to be met, and when might supplementation be needed.
Before we move on from this slide, Sabrina, I think it's really critical for us to be aware that both of the tours, the southern and northern tour for the actual grazing school, both of those have been selected because these folks, these managers of their grazing systems, have integrated many of the components that you actually see described here. And it is allowing them to graze more in terms of 6, 7, 8 months of the year as compared to even longer in the southern part of the state, and how that has impacted their overall profitability. And seeing these things in action really helps us as young, budding grazers to actually experience how you can actually adjust this to fully capture that. Does that mean you have to do this all the first year? Absolutely not. That's not the intent. The intent is just to begin to introduce you to these ideas and concepts. The next slide here is really to help us understand the aspects of some of the terminology that we oftentimes utilize. I have mentioned supplements already during this particular presentation. The supplement of dry matter, for example. This not only provides nutrients in many cases, but it also will, in essence, dry out that ration that they are consuming and actually slow the rate of process or the rate of passage in that animal's ruminant or rumen so that the nutrients can be fully extracted. If it's just pure water, it runs through them so quickly that we don't capture that full value. The next term is substitute, and it's as it suggests, we are taking one component and actually providing something else to actually provide a higher rate of nutrition perhaps. So it might be a harvested forage for a period of time. It might be during a dry period where you don't have adequate forage resources available, and you want the forages the opportunity to grow so that you can actually have enough product out in front of them so they can fully capture the amount of demand that they have for dry matter. These things don't have to be mutually exclusive. We can utilize a supplement while they are on grazing pasture, and that might be in the form of a hay, so that we provide them some grazing every day, but we might also be substituting in some dry forage that has been already harvested to make up that difference. This can be something that we need to do in relationship to high moisture type of vegetation. So we may need to add dry matter. If we have very dry forages, we in many cases think about this as being fairly low in protein, and so adding supplemental protein actually will help increase the digestibility. And then in some cases, if we're introducing grains, that can actually increase the energy needs. For example, if we're flushing ewes or does for breeding. And as you do that, just be aware that sometimes we need to, over time, introduce that so that we don't get into problems with metabolic disorders.
So this picture in the background ties in to a lot of those concepts. Even we're going back to the anti-nutritional factors here. These sheep were grazing an annual mix of forages, and they're grazing it well into the fall when we started to get frost. And there's a high percentage of brassicas in this second graze that they went through. And then we had frost. So what we were worried about one, the brassicas are already really high moisture. The frost is going to damage those plants and lead to a greater digestibility of our nutrients, but that could also lead to bloat. So we didn't have any issues. Do we know for sure that we needed to supplement dry hay at that point? No, but we did it anyways, and thankfully we had no issues. So you'll get to know those intricacies as you go through your grazing journeys, and you'll get better at knowing, when I need to, when I don't need to. Like Troy said, he did everything right, but was still worried about grazing those alfalfa and red clover. So we do what we can to prevent any issues, keeping these items in mind. So we have our plan. We've created our forage chain. We know when we need to supplement, when we don't need to. Then we need to evaluate whether that plan is working. So a few things that we can use to evaluate those rations or those nutrition plans is keeping records. Keeping records is good for many parts of our operation, but we also want to be looking at body condition scoring. We're going to talk about feed utilization, which applies whether we're talking about grazing or eating stored feeds. And then we are going to take a look at our livestock manure. So records. They can be as simple or as complex as you want them to be, but the fact that you have them is what's important. So we're things that will be impacted by our nutrition is of course our livestock performance. We want to keep track of this for many other reasons, but for it could be their eggs, their rate of gain, their milk production, how many multiples do they have if it's small ruminants. We're going to keep track of the disease incidence, of course, again, for many other reasons, but we can have metabolic issues that arise from our nutrition programs. We want to be able to recognize those early, and then we're going to we're going to do body condition scoring, but then we're also going to keep track of those observations that we've made so we can look back. If we do make changes, we can look forward and then compare how that has impacted our livestock. Our feed utilization, we can keep track of, what plants are they actually eating out in the pasture? What's being left behind? How quickly are they going through our paddocks, etc. Those are all things to note and keep notes on. Manure scoring, similar to body condition scoring. It's one thing to look at the manure, but it's another thing to, record those observations and be able to look back on them. And then animal behavior, again, looking at what they're actually grazing. Any odd behaviors like licking dirt or licking excessively metal pieces out in pasture, etc. Some behaviors may be signs of nutritional deficiencies that we want to keep note of.
As we are nearing the end of the presentation, I think it's really important for us to just be cognizant. We have things like production records. There are different types of software packages available to help you make these decisions, as well as economic decisions. Records are really important, and if we don't have a record of it, we can't evaluate it from year to year.
So, like Troy mentioned, we're running short on time here, but we have resources available to go in more depth on how to actually body condition score our beef or our goats. We're working on a sheep video, so stay tuned to that for that. But in any case, body condition scoring, we're looking at those fat reserves and muscling along the skeleton of our livestock, and we're using a scoring system. So we give them a number and we can compare that, later on. So we do it at specific time points. When we are looking at animals individually, when they're running through the chute for some other reason, do this at the same time, collect that information and use it to evaluate your nutrition program. Maybe you need to step it up. We've got a lot of thin cows, or maybe, actually we have too high quality of forage and we need to adjust who's eating what and when. So there's a QR code for the beef video, and we have one for the goat body condition scoring, all similar concepts. For some reason, beef cattle use a different scale than dairy cattle or sheep or goats, so just be aware of the numbering. But as I mentioned, here's just a scoring for sheep, but we will have a video on that in the near future.
As you're going through this process of body condition scoring, I do think it's important for you to not only look at it yourself, but don't be afraid to have other people also critique it as well. Because if you're seeing the animal every single day, you don't have the same reference point as your nutritionist, as your grazing specialist, as your husband or wife or neighbor. So don't be afraid. That's not the intent, but ask for their critical evaluation in relationship to that. And so I think that's really critical to help you get a good frame of reference. As far as feed utilization, this really reverts back to understanding what feeds you have available and which animals will best capture that value.
Manure can tell us a lot, so keep good observations or close observations of our manure. We can score manure just like we can body condition. So, from a 1 to a 5, we have some examples here on the slide. This is from an article from the Noble Research Institute that actually walks through manure scoring and explains it pretty well. So I would search that out if you're interested in learning more. But you can see our score 2 on the left. We have super soft manure, and this is correlated with a greater than 20% crude protein in the diet. So there are points where our protein is too high for different classes of livestock. We're going to see manure like this. Our score in the middle is score 3, maybe is still a bit runny, even like depending again on the stage of production and which species we're talking about. This would be normal for a dairy cow in most cases, but those dairy cows are consuming a 16% crude protein diet usually, and they're producing tons of milk. Whereas our score 5 on the right is quite solid. We're looking at a ration of less than crude or 6% crude protein, probably a bit too stiff there. But again, not uncommon to see for, our dry beef cattle or dry dairy cattle even, we can see some pretty stiff manure, but just use manure as know what you're expecting your ration to be providing, and then use the manure to evaluate if it's doing what you want it for your livestock. So if their manure is too runny, maybe we need to adjust. Maybe we need to provide some more dry matter to um, dilute that crude protein a bit, or maybe their manure is too hard and we need to consider if their nutrient requirements are being met. Anything to add on manure scoring, Troy?
Other than it is a tool that doesn't cost you anything, I think it's really, really important to utilize these tools on a regular basis, weekly basis. Just even when you switch from one pasture type, one forage type to another, you should be watching this and seeing how long that transition occurs. If things are too loose, then what do you do to change that? Are you going to make them eat more of the plant so that you're getting more of the fiber into that diet? Again, doesn't cost you anything. And some of my best dairy farmers are actually people that are the best manure watchers that I work with.
It
This is just
appears
a go ahead.
the video says, I think, shows for you as well that it's private, but I believe if you use the QR code, you should be able to watch it. Anything, did you want to talk about manure washing, Troy?
Nope, that's okay.
Okay, just another tool to maybe less relevant for our grazers, but you can really get a handle on what is being digested in their feed or not. As we strain that manure, we can see what particles are being left behind or not. All right, I know we're at time, but we're just going to reiterate this concept again of our forage quantity and quality and use that to apply to our different grazing management techniques. So again, to beat the dead horse, as our forage digestibility or our forage height and biomass is increasing, our digestibility is decreasing and nutrient content. The potential energy and protein that our livestock can consume is represented by this dotted line. So you can tell, our forage quality is really high in the beginning, but there's not a lot of it. So the potential energy and protein intake still isn't that high. Once we get to that, optimum sweet spot again, you can see that we have high enough quality forage and enough of it to be meeting our needs. So what does their actual energy and protein intake look like? It is actually more like this hump or this hill, because once we get too far into our mature forage, that those nutrients, even though there's a lot of quantity there, the nutrient quality has decreased. And so we have this balance between quantity limiting intake and quality limiting intake. And we're trying to hit this optimum point right in the middle. And we can, you know, throughout the entire season, we're not going to hit it every time, but with our grazing management, we can try to extend the amount of time that we're at this point.
This really relates well to the aspects of looking at what type of management techniques you have for grazing. In a continuous grazing system, you can see the actual graph below indicates the overall quality. When they start out, they are consuming just the tops of those plants, and those tops are very high in nutrient. But as we go through the period of time that they spend in that paddock, that drops down in quality as they are looking more and more and spending more time grazing. And then at some point, the nutrient quality and quantity becomes limiting and drops even lower. With a rotational grazing system, we actually have a high plateau when they start, and then over time, the overall quality might be adequate, but we may run into situations as they stay in that paddock again getting down to that next plateau before they move into the next pasture, the new pasture, where it goes back up to that higher level of quality again for a period of time. Now, if we do much more intensive grazing, what we're trying to do with that particular technique, if they're moving frequently to the tune of every other day, maybe even every day, or maybe even multiple times a day, we want to try and level out that quality throughout the course of time, and we can do that. Now, it isn't quite as high as the rotational grazing because there's a period of time where the animals are very selective if they're spending a week in that rotation, and they actually can achieve higher levels. But we get much more consistent forage quality for those animals in that intensive system.
So to round it all out, what should you be keeping in mind when you're grazing livestock in regards to their nutritional program? Remember, our ruminants are awesome. They turn forage into protein. This is why we love grazing. This does mean, though, at the same time that we have to remember that those requirements fluctuate, just as our grazing season fluctuates, our forage quality is going to fluctuate. That's why it's important that we at least get a baseline for what is out there in our pastures, in our stored feed. Give us an idea of where we're at so we can make our plans. Then we're going to want to monitor those nutrition plans with any number of those tools that we mentioned. And of course, make adjustments as we're trying to accomplish our goals, whatever those might be. Maybe we should have started the presentation with that, but keep in mind those goals. Are you trying to put as much pounds on them as possible? Are you trying to maintain your forage stand to the best of your ability? Hopefully, it's a combination of both of those, but keeping those goals in mind along with the nutrition requirements of your livestock will hopefully get you to some point of success. So there's Troy and I's email addresses. If you have any questions, I can't see the chat. I don't know where it went on my monitors. So if there are questions, please ask them and or send us an email and be sure to attend our in-person schools.
Yeah, I'll just quick check. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you have some, go ahead and drop it. We have a couple minutes here. We could. All right, you covered your material very well. Thank you, Sabrina and Troy. I just want to quick say that I was down in Harmony yesterday and it is gorgeous. It is bluffs and rivers and wildlife. And one of our grazing schools is at Groverland and Cattle right in Harmony. Give yourself a treat and plan on attending that event. It should be beautiful. And I'm sure it's just as pretty up in Duluth at the Jute Farm. Do you have any thoughts, Troy?
Oh, way prettier than way down
Oh,
south.
no.
It's the banana belt that's hot down there. Up north, it'll be nice and cool right by the lake. You can go down and take a swim in the big lake.
The nice comfy lake. Oh, but seriously, please consider joining us. We have some great lunch lined up. The night before, we're going to have a social hour at both locations. You can visit with the families, enjoy good food and company, and there's lots to learn. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.